Every structure you have ever trusted with your life, every bridge you've driven across, every ceiling you've slept beneath, every floor you've stood on without a second thought, is holding weight it never asked for. Wind it didn't choose. Traffic it didn't request. Years of settling ground, shifting beneath it by fractions of an inch it can't control. And it doesn't collapse, not because the weight is light, but because somebody, long before you ever arrived, designed it to carry more than it would ever actually be asked to hold. You are under more load right now than you realize. Not because your life is unusually hard, but because every life eventually applies pressure. A diagnosis, a layoff, a betrayal, a deadline that arrived faster than the plan did. And what determines whether you hold or whether you come apart was never really about the size of the load. It was about what you built quietly, long before the weight ever arrived. The old Stoics understood this better than almost anyone in history, and not from comfortable studies. Marcus Aurelius wrote his private reflections in a military tent at the edge of an empire, while disease moved through his own army and his own household. Epictetus taught freedom of mind from inside a body that legally belonged to someone else for years. Seneca wrote calmly about composure while serving an emperor who would eventually order his death. None of them theorized about pressure from a distance. They built their philosophy while standing directly underneath it. Over what's ahead, we're going to walk through exactly how they did it, not as inspiration you'll forget by tomorrow, but as a structural method you can actually use the next time the weight lands on you without warning. Because the goal was never to build a life with no load on it. There is no such life. The goal is to become something that was engineered to hold far more than it looks like it should be able to. Let's start with the moment the weight first lands, because that is where almost everything is decided. There is a very specific window, somewhere between 1 and 10 seconds, right after bad news arrives, right after the message you didn't want to read, right after the number on the page isn't what you needed it to be. In that window, your mind is not yet thinking, it's reacting. And what most people don't realize is that this first reaction was never designed by you at all. It's inherited, automatic, almost pre-verbal, a nervous system built for a much older, much more physically dangerous world, firing the same alarm whether the threat is an actual predator or an email from your bank. Picture a wall built with no give in it at all. Pure, rigid stone, stacked without a single joint that can move. It looks strong standing still. But the first serious tremor that runs through the ground doesn't bend it. It shatters it all at once because it was never built to absorb anything. It could only resist, and resistance without flexibility eventually breaks. Now picture a wall built the way modern engineers actually build in earthquake country, with joints, with guve, with materials specifically designed to sway several inches without failing. To someone watching from a distance during a tremor, that sway can look alarming, even like weakness. But it's the opposite. The sway is what saves the structure. The rigid wall breaks because it refuses to move at all. The flexible wall survives because it was built to move without breaking. Your first reaction to pressure is that tremor, and the question was never whether you'll feel it. You will every time for the rest of your life. The question is whether the thing that feels the tremor is rigid stone or engineered structure. Epictetus spent years teaching a version of this same idea to Roman students who had far more comfortable lives than he ever did. He told them plainly that people are rarely undone by what actually happens to them. They're undone by the verdict they hand down about what happened, usually within the first few seconds, long before they've actually examined anything. A canceled contract becomes, instantly and without evidence, "My career is over." A hard conversation becomes instantly, "This relationship is finished." The event supplies the tremor. Your mind supplies the shattering, or doesn't. So the actual practice here is almost embarrassingly simple to describe and genuinely difficult to do. When the weight lands, you do not let your first reaction become your final decision. You let it pass through you the way the sway passes through the flexible wall, fully felt, not suppressed, not denied, and then you wait, on purpose, before you respond to anyone, decide anything, or believe a single verdict your mind hands you in that first 10 seconds. Not because the feeling is wrong, but because it's premature. It hasn't finished forming yet, and neither has your understanding of what actually happened. Once the initial tremor has passed through, the second task begins. And this is where most people quietly make the pressure heavier than it needed to be, without noticing they're doing it. An actual event happened. Let's say it's real. A client left. A scan came back with something concerning. A relationship ended badly. That event has a specific size. It is exactly as heavy as it is, no more. But almost immediately your mind starts adding weight to it that was never actually part of the load. It starts calculating what this means about next month, what it means about you as a person, what it might lead to, and then what that might lead to after that, building an entire structure of imagined consequence on top of a single real event, and then experiencing the full weight of that imagined structure as if it had already been built and were already standing on top of you. Engineers have a term for exactly this kind of failure. When a designer, out of caution or fear, keeps adding reinforcement to a structure that was never actually going to need it, and the extra weight of the unnecessary reinforcement becomes its own problem, sometimes a bigger one than the load it was meant to protect against. You can do this to yourself constantly. You take one real, specific, containable event, and you bury it under 6 imagined disasters that haven't happened and, in most cases, never will. Then you wonder why the weight feels unbearable, not realizing that 5/6 of it was never actually real. You built it yourself out of fear and then agreed to carry it. So the second discipline is separation, not denial. Separation. When the pressure lands, ask exactly what happened in the fewest, plainest words you can manage. Not everything is falling apart. One specific thing happened. Then ask separately what you're currently predicting, imagining, or assuming, because that's a different category entirely, built from fear rather than fact. And it deserves to be labeled as such rather than quietly merged into the same pile. Real weight gets carried. Imagined weight gets set down, examined, and usually discarded because it was never load-bearing in the first place. It was speculation wearing the costume of certainty. Marcus Aurelius practiced a version of this constantly in his private writing, stripping events down to their plain, undecorated shape before he let himself react to them. Not to minimize what was genuinely difficult, but to stop unconsciously inflating it with fear dressed up as foresight. He understood that panic doesn't just respond to weight. It manufactures weight continuously, faster than any real event ever could. Underneath both of these, the tremor and the separation, sits something even more basic, and it's physical before it's ever mental. You cannot think your way to calm while your body is still fully convinced it's under attack. When pressure hits, your body moves first and faster than your reasoning ever will. Breath goes shallow, shoulders climb toward your ears, jaw locks, blood moves away from careful thought and toward the muscles your ancestors needed for running or fighting, neither of which is usually the correct response to a difficult email. This is not weakness. It's an old, reliable system doing exactly what it was built to do, several thousand years before it had any concept of deadlines, invoices, or difficult family conversations. The Stoics were not trying to override this system through pure willpower, and neither should you. They were trying to speak to it directly, in the only language a nervous system actually understands, the body itself. A structural engineer inspecting a building under stress doesn't start by reasoning with the building. They start by checking the foundation because everything above it depends on what's happening below. Your breath, your posture, the literal physical steadiness of your body is your foundation. Try to build a calm decision on top of a racing pulse and clenched fists, and you're building a structure on a ground that's still actively shifting. So before you speak, before you type the reply, before you make the call, you do the unglamorous, almost boring physical work first. One slow breath, out longer than it was in. Shoulders drop deliberately, not waiting for them to relax on their own. Feet planted, weight settled, jaw unlocked. This takes perhaps 15 seconds, and it will feel, almost every time, like it's costing you time you don't have. It isn't. It's the only foundation stable enough to hold whatever decision you're about to build on top of it. Pilots are trained for a version of this that's worth understanding, because the stakes make the discipline unmistakable. In serious turbulence or an in-flight emergency, the very first instruction, before anything else, is almost always the same. Fly the airplane. Not solve the whole problem at once. Not diagnose every possible cause simultaneously. Maintain control of the aircraft in this exact moment first before doing anything else. Because a pilot who skips that step to start troubleshooting immediately often loses the one thing that was actually keeping everyone alive in the meantime. Your equivalent of flying the airplane is regulating your body before you try to regulate your circumstances. Skip it, and everything you build afterward is built on ground that's still shaking. Once the foundation is steady, a new problem tends to appear. Not the event itself anymore, but the size of everything the event seems to be demanding from you all at once. Pressure rarely arrives as a single, isolated task. It arrives as an entire skyline you suddenly feel responsible for constructing by tomorrow. The immediate problem, and everyone it affects, and every future consequence and every related worry it drags in behind it, all appearing to need your attention in the exact same instant, and a mind trying to hold an entire skyline at once will collapse under something that, broken into its individual pieces, was never actually that heavy to begin with. No building anywhere has ever been constructed all at once. Every one of them, without exception, goes up one load-bearing piece at a time in a specific order because the frame has to exist before the walls can go up, and the walls have to exist before the roof can go on. A construction crew that tried to build the roof before the foundation was poured wouldn't be seen as ambitious. They'd be seen as about to lose the entire project. Yet this is almost exactly what panic asks you to do with your own problems. Solve the ending before you've addressed the beginning. Worry about next month before you've handled this afternoon. Carry the entire skyline before you've laid a single beam. Marcus Aurelius returned to a version of this discipline so often in his private writing that it's clearly not something he mastered once and moved past. It's something he had to keep re-choosing, probably daily, sometimes hourly. Do the thing directly in front of you, he told himself, and do it as well as it can be done, not everything in front of you, the thing, singular. So when the pressure feels total, the discipline is to deliberately shrink your field of vision, not because the larger problem isn't real, but because no human mind, however capable, can act on an entire skyline simultaneously. It can only ever act on the next beam. What is the one actual thing right now, today, that would move this forward? Not the 5-year consequence, not the worst-case ending, the next beam. Place it, then ask the question again. This isn't avoidance of the larger problem. It's the only method that has ever actually solved a larger problem, one load-bearing piece at a time, in the correct order, instead of all at once and out of sequence. There's a kind of pressure this doesn't yet account for, and it's arguably the more dangerous kind, because it never announces itself the way a single crisis does. It's not the tremor of one bad phone call. It's the slow, repeated flexing of an ordinary week over and over, month after month, with no single moment heavy enough to notice on its own. Engineers call this fatigue loading, and it behaves in a way that surprises people the first time they learn about it. A bridge can be rated to carry loads far heavier than anything that will ever cross it, and still develop a crack from something as unremarkable as ordinary daily traffic, not because any single vehicle was too heavy, but because the structure was flexed, released, thousands upon thousands of times, without ever getting a full cycle of rest between each one. The load that eventually causes the failure is often smaller than the load the structure was originally designed to withstand in a single instance. It isn't the size of the weight that breaks it. It's the absence of recovery between repetitions. This is almost exactly what happens to a person who is technically handling everything week after week, and still ends up hollowed out by something that, on paper, wasn't even that serious. Not one catastrophic event, 100 ordinary ones, the notification, the difficult conversation, the deadline, the small disappointment, each one manageable on its own, each one flexing you slightly and then releasing, but never with enough space between them for the material to actually settle back into its resting shape before the next flex arrives. You don't collapse under the one big thing. You develop a hairline crack from 6 months of never fully putting the last thing down before the next thing landed. The Stoics were not indifferent to rest, whatever the popular image of grim, unfeeling endurance might suggest. Seneca wrote to a friend that even the fields need a fallow season, and that a mind driven without pause will eventually give out in exactly the way overworked soil does. Not gloriously in one dramatic collapse, but quietly, in a slow loss of the capacity it once had. He wasn't describing laziness. He was describing maintenance, the unglamorous, unrewarded work of letting a structure return to its resting shape before asking it to flex again. This is why the discipline here isn't only about handling the acute moment when pressure spikes. It's about noticing when you've been in a state of constant, low-grade flexing for weeks without a real cycle of recovery, and treating that pattern as seriously as you'd treat a single dramatic crisis, because structurally, it can end up costing you just as much, simply more slowly and with less warning. A single missed night of proper rest is a flex. A conversation you're still carrying 3 days later, unresolved, is a flex that never fully released. A commitment you said yes to out of guilt rather than capacity is a flex you added on top of flexes that hadn't finished settling yet. The practical version of this is almost insultingly plain, which is probably why it gets skipped so often. You need actual, scheduled, non-negotiable recovery, not the leftover time after everything else has taken what it wanted, but protected space, placed into the week on purpose, the same way an engineer schedules an inspection rather than waiting for visible damage to force one. Sleep that isn't treated as the first thing sacrificed when the week gets busy. A conversation that actually gets finished instead of quietly shelved. A commitment declined specifically because you noticed you hadn't recovered from the last one yet. None of this looks impressive. None of it will show up as an achievement anyone congratulates you for. But a structure that gets its recovery cycles tends to be the one still standing years after an equally strong structure that never got any of its own quietly failed under a load that on paper should never have been enough to bring it down. There is underneath all of this a deeper and more uncomfortable distinction the Stoics insisted on, and it's the one most people resist the longest, because giving it up feels like giving up control rather than gaining it. Some weight is genuinely yours to redistribute, reinforce, or remove, and some weight belongs to the ground itself. The underlying conditions of reality that were never going to move no matter how hard you pushed against them, other people's decisions, the past, already poured and set, outcomes that depend on 100 variables outside your hands. An engineer doesn't spend their career arguing with bedrock, demanding it behave differently, wasting their entire budget trying to reshape ground that was never going to change. They study the bedrock exactly as it is, and they design everything they can control around it. This is, almost word for word, the distinction Epictetus placed at the very center of his entire teaching. Some things are within your power. Your judgment, your effort, your response, the character you bring into a situation. Nearly everything else is not, including, frustratingly, most of what you actually want to control the most. How people see you, how events turn out, whether your effort gets rewarded in the way it deserves to be. Confuse the two categories. Spend your strength fighting the bedrock instead of designing around it, and pressure becomes not just difficult but genuinely unbearable because now you're fighting two things at once: the real problem and reality itself for daring to contain a real problem. There's an old teaching attributed to one of the earliest Stoics that fate leads the willing and drags the unwilling, meaning the load is coming toward you either way, and your only real choice is whether you walk into it upright or get pulled into it on your back. That's not surrender. It's closer to what a sailing captain does with wind they didn't choose and can't stop. They don't argue with it. They adjust the sail angle and use the exact same wind that would have driven a rigid, badly angled boat straight into the rocks. So when pressure lands, before spending a single unit of energy wishing it were different, ask plainly which parts of this are bedrock and which parts are actually yours to move. The outcome usually is bedrock. Your preparation for it is not. Someone else's decision is bedrock. Your response to it is not. Spend your strength exclusively on the second category. The first category was never going to pay you back for the effort, no matter how much of yourself you poured into arguing with it. There's a particular danger that shows up once the pressure has been sitting on you for a while, and it's more corrosive than the original event ever was, because it changes the target from what happened to who you are. It's the difference between saying, "I'm going through something difficult right now," and saying, quietly to yourself, "I am someone this keeps happening to," or "I am someone who can't handle this." The first sentence describes a season. The second sentence has quietly rewritten your identity to match your circumstances. And once that rewrite happens, every future difficulty stops being a separate event and starts being confirmation of a verdict you've already accepted about yourself. Structural engineers make a careful distinction between a crack and a failure, and it matters enormously which one you're looking at. A crack means the structure absorbed stress and is showing it. A failure means the structure gave way entirely. Almost every standing building on Earth has cracks somewhere in it. Hairline fractures from decades of settling, temperature change, minor tremors it successfully survived. The presence of a crack is not evidence the building is about to fall. It's evidence the building has been tested and is still standing. The mistake is treating every crack as proof of an impending collapse, when in most cases it's simply proof of load successfully carried. You are allowed to have cracks. A failed relationship is a crack, not a verdict on your capacity to love. A financial setback is a crack, not proof you're incapable with money. A season where you genuinely struggled to hold everything together is a crack, not a permanent redefinition of who you fundamentally are. The building that matters isn't the one with no cracks in it. That building doesn't exist anywhere for anyone, ever. It's the one whose foundation holds regardless of how many cracks the surface has absorbed along the way. Marcus Aurelius, ruling through plague, war, and the deaths of several of his own children, kept returning not to what was happening to him, but to a much narrower and more stubborn question: what kind of person he intended to remain while it was happening. The circumstances were entirely outside his authority. The character he brought into them never stopped being his to decide. That's the actual question worth asking under pressure. Not why is this happening to me, but who, specifically, am I choosing to be while it's happening? That question quietly separates your identity from your circumstances, which is the only way to survive circumstances without losing yourself inside them. There's a second, quieter source of pressure that has nothing to do with the actual event and everything to do with who's watching you handle it. And it deserves its own honest look, because it's often heavier than the original problem. You feel it as the need to look composed in front of people whose opinion you've decided matters. The pressure to have the right answer immediately, in front of a room, rather than admitting you need time. The pressure to protect an image of yourself you built years ago and now feel obligated to keep defending long after it stopped fitting who you actually are or what you're actually going through. Every building has to satisfy an inspector at some point. A code, a standard, a set of requirements imposed from outside. But there's a difference between a structure that's genuinely sound and one that's merely been dressed up to pass an inspection, while the actual load-bearing elements underneath remain untested and unreliable. You can spend your entire life maintaining the appearance of structural soundness for an audience of inspectors, while the real foundation, the one nobody's checking, the one that actually determines whether you hold up under real weight, goes completely unattended. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself often that the good opinion of others was never something within his authority to guarantee, no matter how carefully he behaved. Someone who admires you today may misunderstand you completely tomorrow, for reasons that have nothing to do with anything you actually did. If your composure depends entirely on their continued approval, you haven't built a foundation. You've built a performance, and performances require a constantly present, constantly satisfied audience to keep standing, which is an exhausting, unstable thing to depend on for something as important as your own peace of mind. This doesn't mean ignoring every piece of outside feedback, the way a reckless builder might ignore every code as if the codes were always wrong. Some criticism genuinely reveals a real structural flaw worth addressing. The discipline is in the sorting, examining feedback for whether it points at something true and load-bearing, or whether it's simply noise from someone who wanted you to build differently than you actually needed to, for reasons that were about their comfort rather than your soundness. Keep the first. Set down the second, without carrying it another day just because it arrived wearing the tone of authority. There's one more piece of the design that matters enormously, and it's the part almost nobody thinks about until they're already standing under the load, wishing they'd thought about it sooner. Engineers never design a structure to hold exactly the weight they expect it to carry and not 1 ounce more. They build in what's called a safety margin, deliberate extra capacity well beyond the anticipated load, specifically so that an unexpected gust, an unusually heavy crowd, a miscalculation somewhere in the original planning doesn't immediately become a catastrophe. A well-designed structure isn't operating at the edge of its limits on an ordinary day. It has room left over, held in reserve precisely for the day that isn't ordinary. Most people are living with no margin at all, and they don't discover it until the exact moment they need it most. Every hour of the calendar is already spoken for. Every dollar of the budget is already assigned somewhere before it arrives. Every ounce of patience is already being spent on the ordinary demands of an ordinary week, with nothing held back. And then the unexpected load arrives. The health scare, the sudden expense, the crisis that wasn't on anyone's calendar. And there is nothing left in reserve to absorb it, because the structure was already operating at full capacity on a day when nothing had even gone wrong yet. This is not a failure of character. It's a failure of design, and it's fixable in exactly the way an engineer would fix it. Not by trying to become stronger in the moment the unexpected load lands, which is usually too late, but by deliberately building margin in before it's needed, on the ordinary days when nothing is asking for it yet. Sleep that isn't scheduled down to the last possible minute. A budget with slack in it that isn't already promised to something else. Relationships maintained during calm periods, not neglected until a crisis forces you to reach for them. Commitments decline not because you're currently overwhelmed, but specifically so you don't become overwhelmed the moment something unexpected arrives. Marcus Aurelius, governing an empire that could produce a crisis on any given morning without warning, didn't wait for the crisis to start building the internal discipline he'd need to meet it. The reflections he left behind read like a man rehearsing in advance on ordinary days for demands he knew were eventually coming but couldn't yet name. That is what margin actually is. Not pessimism, not constant bracing for disaster, simply the quiet, unglamorous decision to build more capacity than today currently requires, because today is rarely the day that actually tests it. There's a final, deeper shift available here, and it's the one that actually changes your relationship with pressure permanently rather than just helping you survive one instance of it. Consider an arch, one of the oldest, most stubbornly reliable structural forms humans have ever built, still standing in places thousands of years after the people who built it are gone. An arch is unusual among structures because of what it does with weight pressing down on it from above. Instead of resisting that downward force the way a flat beam does, straining against it until it eventually cracks, the arch's curved shape converts the downward pressure into outward and downward compression along its own curve, channeling the load into the ground through its own structure. The heavier the load pressing down on a well-built arch, within reason, the more tightly it locks itself together at the keystone. It doesn't merely survive the weight. In a very real, physical sense, the weight is part of what holds it together. This is not a comfortable metaphor to offer someone in the middle of real difficulty, and it isn't meant to minimize genuine tragedy. Some weight is simply loss, plainly and without any silver lining attached, and pretending otherwise does no one any favors. But there is a real and repeatable pattern underneath real difficulty that the Stoics kept returning to, not as comfort but as strategy. Pressure, met with the right internal structure, doesn't just get survived. It becomes part of what the structure is eventually made of. The discipline you build handling one crisis becomes load-bearing the next time weight arrives. The patience forced on you by one delay becomes available capacity the next time you need it. Nothing about the original event needs it have been good for this to be true. It only requires that you were willing to let the pressure shape you, rather than simply survive it and wait for it to end. There's one last piece of engineering worth understanding because it explains something about pressure that none of the previous discipline quite covers. Why certain kinds of weight seem to take you down so much faster than their actual size would suggest, while other loads, objectively heavier, barely touch you at all. Structures don't only fail from raw weight. They can fail from something stranger and, in its own way, more dangerous, a load that happens to arrive at exactly the wrong rhythm. Every structure has what engineers call a natural frequency, a particular rate at which it wants to oscillate if disturbed. Most of the time, this is irrelevant because most loads don't match it. But when a force happens to push a structure at precisely its own natural rhythm, something unusual happens. Each new push doesn't just add to the last one, it amplifies it, building on the motion that came before, until oscillations that started small become large enough to tear the structure apart. Not because the force was unusually strong, but because it was unusually well matched to that specific structure's particular vulnerability. This is, more than people usually admit, exactly how certain pressures affect certain people. Two individuals can face what looks from the outside like an identical difficulty, a canceled plan, a sharp comment, a moment of being overlooked, and one of them absorbs it without much cost at all, while the other is disproportionately shaken by something that, measured objectively, wasn't especially large. This isn't a character flaw in the second person. It usually means the load happened to land at their particular frequency. An old pattern, an old wound, a specific fear that this exact kind of moment has learned to resonate with, so that a small push lands with far more force than its actual size would predict, because it's not really being met on its own. It's arriving on top of every other time something similar landed, and the accumulated motion is what actually does the damage. The Stoics didn't have the engineering vocabulary for this, but Seneca described something close to it when he wrote about the specific wounds that never quite finish healing, the ones that don't need much provocation to reopen because they were never fully closed in the first place. He didn't treat this as weakness to be ashamed of. He treated it as information, a signal about exactly where a person's particular structure needed reinforcement that a stranger's identical structure might not need at all. This is why the discipline of handling pressure can't stop at generic technique, applied identically to every situation as though all pressure were interchangeable. Part of the work is learning your own specific frequency. Which categories of pressure, for reasons that may have very little to do with the size of the event itself, consistently land on you harder than they would on someone else? Being excluded, being corrected in front of others, being asked to explain yourself. Silence where you expected a response, different for everyone, and rarely proportional to how it would look ranked on a neutral scale of objective severity. Once you know your own frequency, you can do something a structure can't do for itself. You can recognize in real time when a small load is landing at exactly the wrong rhythm and building faster than its actual size justifies. And you can name that gap out loud, even just to yourself. This isn't disproportionate. This is proportional to something older than today. That single act of naming it, separating the current small event from the accumulated resonance it happens to be triggering, is often enough to keep the oscillation from building any further. You're not pretending the old pattern doesn't exist. You're simply refusing to let today's small, ordinary load quietly borrow all the force of every similar moment that came before it. So the question worth asking, once you've handled the tremor, separated the real weight from the imagined, steadied your body, taken the next beam instead of the whole skyline, sorted the bedrock from what's actually yours to move, and stopped confusing the crack with a verdict on who you are. The question worth asking isn't, when will this pressure finally leave? It's, what is this pressure specifically asking me to reinforce? More patience, more discipline, better boundaries, a steadier foundation than the one you were standing on before this arrived. Then you build that deliberately, on purpose, using the exact weight that's currently sitting on top of you as the material. None of this requires you to stop feeling the pressure while it's happening. That was never the actual goal. And anyone promising you a version of strength with no felt weight in it is selling you something that doesn't exist and never has. The goal was never an absence of load. It was a foundation engineered to hold more than it looks like it should be able to. Steady, not because the storm above it went easy, but because beam by beam, decision by decision, on the days nobody was watching, you built it to hold exactly this. The pressure is coming again. It always does, for everyone, without exception, no matter how carefully anyone builds their life. The only real question left is whether what's underneath you, the next time it lands, was built to hold it.